Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the video that absolutely nobody has been waiting for. I mean, be honest here. Does anybody play Feral anymore? I feel like you've been neglected a lot in LFG, and at the point you've pretty much abandoned the Feral specialization back to the shelter. It's been a rough time. Okay, it's had a tough time. Now moving into Shadowlands, one of the most fortunate things in my mind for the spec is that cleave damage is being limited heavily. So in spells that in Battle for Azeroth that would hit all targets around you or apply to all targets around you are beginning to be limited down to a number of only maybe 3 to 5 targets. And this benefits Feral a lot. Being able to maintain full bleeds on multiple targets can be difficult when you get into the 10 plus range of monsters. So if the pulls are starting to be restricted down to 3 monsters, it's very easily possible at that point to maintain bleeds on multiple targets. And if bleeds end up being the main strength of the spec, then maybe Feral starts getting invited from some of those LFG groups. That was my first assessment of the specialization overall. And again, that is more focused on PvE, but the guide will be talking about both and how the specialization fits in as a whole. So when we jump into Feral Druid, what should you expect to see? Well, Bark Skin is back. So you're going to get some added damage reduction that you can use while stunned. Perfect in PvP, as dying in a stun was frequently a common occurrence. So this will help you out not dying in a stun. And then also you get a little bit of extra beefiness in bear form. So if you pre-bear form, pre-iron fur, boost up your armor. It's going to be just a little nice addition. Maybe become an off tank for a couple of seconds. If your tank needs a break, there's some sort of mechanic that if it stacks up one more time, he's going to die. So you can just taunt over, buff up yourself with that iron fur and tank a hit for them. Cyclone is baseline. Depending on what Blizzard decides to do in terms of, is this going to be immune on every target that you try and cast it on? We'll have to find out. I mean, is it going to work to stop bursting? So if a bunch of monsters are getting low and you don't want bursting to rack up really quickly, you could cyclone a monster before it dies and it's immune to damage and delay the bursting stack. I mean, there's huge affix potential play around with Cyclone in general. Cyclone a mob before it starts getting necrotic stacked up too high. I mean, it could either be the absolute most ridiculous Mythic Plus ability, or they make every monster immune to it, and then in PvE you don't really care that it came back. In PvP you're really happy that this came back as a baseline because it gets you an extra honor talent. So we'll have to wait and see for PvE, but for PvP obviously it is awesome to see Cyclone come back as a baseline spell, and that's going to be all the spells really returning to Druid, or more particularly Feral, that it didn't already have. And then when we look at the Feral Tree itself, you still have Survival Instincts, however, only 1 charge instead of 2. I think it's a fair trade to being able to get another damage reduction that you can be used while crowd controlled. You could stack them at the same time for a big hit of damage in PvE if you know you're about to lose 80% of your health in one attack. There's a lot more outplay potential having 2 different damage reduction cooldowns in that sense. When do you want to allocate them based on their power? So I like that in terms of defensive cooldown management. And do remember, I'm working on a tier list at the moment for melee DPS and Shadowlands, the main focus being fun and engagement. So how long can I play this spec before I'm bored out of my mind and I just want to play something else? Because in my mind, that's the most important factor to picking your specialization in Shadowlands, because you're pretty much committed to it. It's going to be like pulling teeth out to try and switch over to other ones, and your progress is going to matter a lot. So to me, you want to pick a spec that you're not going to get bored out of your mind. Feral so far is looking good in that regard for me personally, because it has a lot of the things that I look for. It's still maintaining its identity from Battle for Azeroth in terms of trying to maintain bleeds on multiple targets, and trying to expend energy and pool energy to go for big ferocious bite hits. So it's still very similar. There's not much changing in that regard for the spec baseline. It's just a couple of extra little utility spells have been returned to the spec, and then leading back into the talents, right? Two of the major things that stand out to me for Feral that are changing from Battle for Azeroth is the Affinity Tree, granting you access to a couple of extra spells. So in PvE, you are just basically default running Balance Affinity, which means you now get Typhoon without having to drop one of these options down here on the level 35 talent row. So Typhoon is an awesome Mythic Plus mechanic. You can knock out of Sanguine Puddles. Just knockbacks in general are really powerful. So now that you get this baked in with some extra utility, is going to increase the competitive viability for Feral Druid and Mythic Plus. Now, depending on the pacing of PvP, if damage output is, if Ferals aren't dying like glass cannons, you could go back to running Balance Affinity like what was run in Legion, and then you would also get access to Typhoon as an extra interrupt. And Ferals have a ton of disruption and lockdown, so that's going to add a lot if the Balance Affinity is something you go for in PvP. But I feel like it's unlikely. Guardian affinities are getting incapacitating roar. At the moment, it automatically puts you into bear form, which, I mean, it's awkward if you're trying to attack somebody and interrupt them with it, or crowd control someone behind you and still attack your target, and then suddenly you lose a global to go into bear form. It seems really odd that it does that. I'm trying to think of any other bear buttons that automatically, like, you can't press frenzy regeneration and it puts you into bear, and that would be really good if that happened. This is something that puts you into bear that's just like, I don't want this. So it's still great. You get a little bit of an extra crowd control, and because it's labeled incapacitating, it's likely on Polymorph diminishing return. So it's not on Cyclone diminishing return or Root. So you'd have 3 diminishing returns of crowd control, something to take into account for PvP. In PvE, you beef yourself up for a little bit of extra damage reduction, but in general, getting the extra range on your spells is superior. There's a couple legendaries also that synergize with this tier that I think are going to be very interesting to look through a little bit later on in the video. And for restoration affinities, now you're also getting Ursul's Vortex. It's very similar to Typhoon, and it still helps your group out just as much. It's just sort of in the opposite direction. You pull mobs together, so when they're trying to scatter and run, if they're running away at low health to aggro other mobs, or they need to go and activate some sort of lever that you don't want them to because you're going to lose if they do, this is a great spell to just keep everything together. In PvP, you can help your healer. If they're getting chased around, put this down on the warriors, they get pulled back in. Or if you're going after a healer, put it down, and then the healer can't get out of line of sight of potentially your marksmanship hunter. We can hope that a marksmanship hunter ends up being that good. But the affinity tier stood out to me. And then Heart of the Wild, of course, coming back for Druids was a big standout. It's down 1 minute from what it was in Miss Pandaria, so it's 5-minute cooldown instead of 6-minute cooldowns. Unfortunately for Feral in PvE, because you run Balance Affinity pretty much all of the time, your benefit here of damage of your balance abilities increased by 30%. Star Surge is instant. I mean, it would have to be so dramatically massive damage increasing for you to go into Boomkin form and start casting as a Boomkin instead of being a Feral. The only situations I could see this being possible is maybe like a dragon fight where the dragon's no longer on the ground like on Nixia way back in the day, and they're flying above you. So you pop that Heart of the Wild, jump in Boomkin form, and start pumping the dragon like you're a Boomkin. It's probably less DPS than Feral, but it's still more than 0. In PvE, it's going to be, I think, a bit difficult to utilize Heart of the Wild. And in my mind, in PvE, you're probably running Mass Entanglement just because of its great utility on bosses that spawn like walls that move in, and those monsters are usually rootable, so you can just root them, and then that wall doesn't crush your whole raid. Or if an ad spawns and it's an ad with a lot of health, you don't want to actually attack it, you just root it off in the distance. It's excellent utility. And then Bash sort of falls off in PvE comparatively to Mass Entanglement. Other classes have better stuns and shorter cooldowns, but in PvP, obviously, Bash is really strong. So in my mind, you're debating between Mighty Bash and Heart of the Wild for PvP, because in PvP, you're probably going to be running Resto Affinity or Guardian Affinity to help out your survivability and healing for the team, and extra range isn't as valuable to you. So Heart of the Wild does get value for Ferals when it comes to PvP, as you get extra charges of Frenzy Regen for heals, you get extra health. It's going to really beef you up in that bear farm. And then as Restoration, obviously, you're going to get more healing output, which has good synergy with Honor talents, which is oddly enough also named Heart of the Wild. You get a regrowth critical strike when you're casting on another target, so boosted healing with 100% crit seems pretty good in PvP. but you do get some extra utility. It's just going to be in PvE where this probably has less value. You're more likely going to be doing this. Maybe some synergies with Convoke the Spirits, but again, it's tough. It's tough to make Heart of the Wild work for Feral in PvE. When we jump down here, not too much is changing. Soul of the Forest is generally you go to unless you want to run an Incarnation build. Interestingly enough, Primal Wrath likely going to be your Mythic Plus go-to, right? Still, just for applying a rip to all targets. Take that into account. Rip to all enemies. I think that's going to be very important to look at when you're looking at your spec if you're a Mythic Plus runner and you want to push high keys, because a lot of things are now hits 3 targets within a certain range, which is a massive nerf. All targets is big. So it means that you're going to be more valuable on big trash pulls if it still ends up being the meta for Mythic Plus where you just pull as much as you can. So Primal Wrath could get a lot of value there. Blood Talons is changing. If you were used to this in the past, you would cast a regrowth before applying a bleed to buff it. Now it's just do your rotation basically, and you'll get a buff that you can increase the damage of your rip or ferocious. It makes it more smooth in cat form. You don't have to use the heal to buff your damage, which means you can use the heal as a heal, or in Mythic Plus, since it's a healer's job to heal, and I mean, it kind of is in PvP too. You can time when you want a regrowth rather than baking it into your rotation. I'm sure some people will like that and other people won't like that. It seems like a little bit of a subjective change, but it's your next 2 rips or ferocious bites, so you could go for some big ferocious bite combos in PvP, or just get 2 buffed rips up moving on to the trash monsters. There's not too much changing in the honor talents, really not too much changing in talents in general for Feral. It's more or less remaining the same, just a couple of baseline abilities coming back, and depending on how they want to make it work in dungeons in terms of immunities to crowd controls and such, Ferals could either have an awesome place, maybe a mandatory place, or just kind of meh. So it's still a lot down to tuning. When we move over to the legendaries, which I believe are now more or less all complete, but probably still subject to change with beta. These are general legendary powers, which means any druid spec can get them. You probably want to take these into consideration if you're somebody who likes to flex between different specs. So if you like playing a little bit of Moon Kingdom Feral or a little bit of Resto and such, so you may want to consider that. To me, the Druid Runecarve 4 is one that just doesn't work with like any specialization of Druid. The main goal of Druid is to get dots on as many things as possible and hots on as many things as possible. So to limit yourself, limit your strength for a 30% buff on one target. It's possible if there's a boss fight where there's literally only one target to hit the entire time, like Patchwork. Maybe this legendary is absolutely insane, right, for Feral, and I'm just focusing on Feral. But a lot of fights, especially in Ny'alotha, are just, there's mobs everywhere. So you want to dot all of them. This wouldn't get any value. Seems like a really hard legendary still to sell, even as Feral, but maybe this 30% is big enough that in Arena, for example, you just focus only one target and you're raking your Moonfire and your Rip, just tear them apart. It's possible, right? This is something that's going to need a little bit of testing, but it seems a little bit awkward. It's not one that I'm likely going after unless it becomes obviously apparent that it's super good. The other one here, which I am considering strongly, is your damage over time effects deal their damage in 25% less time, and your healing time over effects occur in 15% less time. Now, Feral Druids do get quite a bit of downtime from being starved on energy, so maybe it backfires, but I was thinking of the synergies of this with the Swarm from the Necrolords, buffing up your damage over time effects, so they tick faster and hit harder. I thought that could be an interesting combination for Feral, maybe more or less in PvP, because some of the other legendaries are likely going to just be mandatory in PvE because of their throughput potential. But this fit into a playstyle that I enjoy with managing your damage over time effects, and it fits for me personally with the fantasy of Feral Druid a lot better. So I did like this legendary. It's one that I'm probably going to be going after no matter what spec of Druid I'm playing, which is nice because it's a general Druid legendary. Druid Runecarve 1 here. So this is the buffs to your Affinity Tree, right? And remember, in PvE, you're pretty much always running Boomkin, which means that you would be getting even more range on your spells, increased by 75%. So really good in PvE. You can avoid whirlwind mechanics probably by just still being able to attack the monster. So it seems like it could be really good depending on how many of whirlwind boss effects there are. I'm thinking of Freehold right now with the shark dude, the shark guy spinning around. Now Thick Hide getting a little bit extra damage reduction too at all times could be really powerful. Movement speed, although you're feral, so you don't get this benefit. Ysera's gift healing for more is also really awesome just as a passive, but this one might be undervalued. The only other real benefit is that when you shift into your Affinity's form, you gain Heart of the Wild. So again, maybe if there's a boss fight where the monster flies away and can only be hit by ranged, you could run this legendary to buff up your Astral Influence, get Heart of the Wild as well when you switch into Boomkin form, and you just temporarily turn into a crit chicken for a little bit. There could be some nice playability with this legendary, but unfortunately in PvE, when it comes to fun playability, those usually just kind of fall off. In PvP, every minute you're going to get a big Heart of the Wild heal. Your Sarah's Gift is always healing for more. Or your Thick Hide is just reducing damage on yourself at all times. You get 2 charges of Frenzy Regeneration when you go in bear form. Really good for dueling in PvP in my mind. I mean, that seems almost like a mandatory dueling legendary, and possibly has good potential in 3 versus 3 with the rest of Affinity. So this is a legendary in PvP that I'm strongly considering. In PvE, it's a little bit harder to sell. This one is really odd. Lakara's Fleeting Glimpse. Every 45 seconds while in combat, you cast a spell based on your form. They're really all about this like automatic stuff, like Convoke the Spirits with Night Phage, just like automatically cast this. So you'd probably need a week or to figure out every 45 seconds when this is triggered, which is kind of annoying, unless they find a visual to put into the game for it. If you're just in normal form, you cast Wild Growth. It's kind of just meh. I mean, you shouldn't want to be healing. Maybe you absolutely need to in a raid, but you really wouldn't want to be. You would love to be casting Primal Wrath for free, and just applying that. We assume that it's a maximum combo point. I feel like it should be a maximum combo point. Primal Wrath every 45, you just get a free one, so you can use something else like a Ferocious Bite, or this. So this seems pretty good to me, overall. Especially for trash pulls, if you can time it, but maybe it doesn't line up perfectly 45 seconds with trash pulls. If you're in bear form, it'll be Barkskin. So if you do track the timer of this, and the only thing is that it is random, so you're going to have to kind of hope that the other team wants to actually commit damage to you in PvP for this to get value. And then if you're in Moonkin form, you'll cast Starfall. So technically with Balance Affinity, you have no way to cast Starfall as Feral. I do wonder if it did enough damage that you would actually switch into balance form, and then have Starfall go running and maybe pop Heart of the Wild for a couple of seconds. I feel like the answer is no. This one seems just kind of fun and odd, which means it's probably not competitive. Or in travel form, you'll cast Stampeding Roar. It's kind of meh compared to Primal Wrath or Barkskin, right? So this legendary, it's odd right now to me. It just stands out as kind of odd. It's probably one that you're just not going to pay much attention to. Moving down to the specific Feral Druid legendary. So if you're intending on only playing Feral and not flexing, then these ones will more likely benefit you the most. Rip damage has 4% chance to make your Ferocious Bite free and deal the maximum damage. Really nice burst damage there. I mean, in PvP, that's an obvious selling point. Getting free Ferocious Bites to maintain stacks of health reduction from your honor talents. Just big damage in general. Really powerful for single targets. I mean, it seems a pretty bulletproof pick there. Apex, compared to that kind of like odd, you cast something that you don't really want to cast every 45 seconds, other than the AoE rip, but Druid Runecarve 4, combo point generating abilities reduce the cooldown of Incarnation by 0.2 seconds. And during Incarnation, they cause the target to bleed for an additional 50% of their damage over 8 seconds. So if you combined this with the Swarm from the Necrolords, if you waited until your Incarnation window, you could buff your bleed damage during that burst window by a lot. And then you could reduce the cooldown so it lines up better with Swarm, because Swarm, I believe, is only 25-second cooldown. That could have some really powerful synergies. Although this is pretty much locking you into an Incarnation build of the spec. But in PvP, it could be really good. And then getting this cooldown off of being 3 minutes, so it doesn't line up with healer defensive cooldowns that are usually around 3 minutes. Seems like it would be really powerful there. And it could have potential in PvE for, I would imagine, single target. Maybe not even, though. Could be good AoE burst. Incarnation might be making a comeback as a baseline maybe with this legendary. I have to wait and see for the tuning. obviously. Druid Feral Runecarve 2. Tiger's Fury causes your next finishing move to restore 3 combo points. I mean, you are going to be starved on energy and starved on combo points, but you're going to give up a legendary slot for like this kind of insane stuff. Maybe, obviously my experience on Feral is pretty limited, so if anybody is like a main Feral Druid and is like, oh, you're absolutely crazy for saying that's just meh, please point it out to me, because right now I'm looking at that and I'm just going meh. Druid Feral Runecarve 1. Clear cast abilities generate 25% of their energy cost, and your maximum energy is increased by 60. So if you're really struggling and having a hard time with energy regeneration, especially at the start of an expansion when stats are so low, maybe this is a go-to. It could be a good go-to. I'm still, these ones are still kind of standing out the most to me at the moment in terms of their potential. Free big ferocious bites, reduce cooldowns on incarnation, and then extra bleed damage during your cooldowns. I mean, again, these are more like about your energy resource management, and then these ones are just raw output. So it really depends on how Feral ends up feeling is in terms of its generation and energy. Is it starved a lot? Then you might have to go for these. If it ends up not being, then you just go out for the raw pressure. I think in PvP you would go for the raw pressure. So the legendaries are a little bit tough here. To me, it's the standout of your damage effects tick faster, maybe something to do with this Heart of the Wild one, and then these two for damage, and then these two for resource or energy management. The Covenant ability, so this is the biggest choice that you're going to be making in Shadowlands and for Druid. And the Kyrian one ended up being probably the biggest disappointment for Covenant abilities overall. I think a lot of people were anticipating a return of Symbiosis, and I remember when people were telling me like they thought Symbiosis was coming back, and I'm like, hey, sure enough, I don't see anything that looks anything like it. This is nothing like it. This is not Symbiosis. You're not getting a spell or a skill from the person you cast it on. It's just basically you get extra damage from them, and you give extra damage to them. It seems like it's really, what's the word? It's a lot of high effort, and I'm not sure if you're rewarded for how much high effort. So in PvP, you'd probably want a macro, like an Arena 1-2-3 macro. So you could cast it onto your healer if you felt like you needed more healing. You could cast it on your DPS partner if you felt like you wanted more damage at a specific moment. So you're going to need a lot of keybinds to make this one work. You can use it on yourself for just 10% damage, but it's likely not as potent as using it on an ally. The way that it's built, I would think they intend it to be more potent when using it on an ally. Not to say that it doesn't get a benefit on yourself. So if you're just going through Torghast and questing and stuff, then you just obviously cast it and you get 10% damage. But using it on an ally, you're likely going to need macros. So in Mythic Plus, it's the same thing. And you got even more targets. In raids, you probably just like, all right, you're my kindred spirit partner, and I don't want to keep buying this to anybody else. That's too much thinking. Again, if you're somebody who likes that stuff, and I am somebody who likes that kind of depth, this is a good option. Kyrian also get stun reductions in their soul binds when you're moving down the specific talent trees. I believe it's the Moonkin, the Soulkin one. You're gonna get chances to reduce stuns on yourself. That's amazing for Feral. So even though does seem cumbersome, I feel like it is one that will work well for Feral. And then obviously Summon Steward gives you a vial, and it's just an extra heal, and that with some added benefits that you can amplify. So it's just great for a little extra utility. And in PvP, hopefully they flag the vial to be usable in PvP, because I think it's considered a consumable, which consumables aren't usable in rated PvP combat. So it needs to be flagged to be like a Hellstone or something. As soon as that happens, which I feel like it should, then obviously you'll be getting a benefit of this as well. For PvP, that is. In PvE, you're obviously going to be able to use it. Ravenous Frenzy. This is one that synergizes well with 3-minute cooldowns. So the Incarnation build, if you're running. But reducing the cooldown of it could backfire. So maybe now actually you'd want to run the Apex Predator, because you would probably want this to line up with your Incarnation. You get stacks of haste, but if you stand idle for 1.5 seconds, you get stunned and you take a pretty big chunk of damage, depending on how high you ended up stacking. It's a really fun and cool spell. I hope that it ends up working out, because I love the risk versus reward, the kiss versus curse. If you max this thing out, you go nuts. But if you drop the ball, then you're going to regret it. So in PvE, most of the time you can avoid crowd control or time this around a window when you know you can't avoid it. In PvP, on the other hand, you can't. And if the other team knows you have this, they're just going to wait for it. And then they could let you stack it up on purpose and then stun you, and boom, you just lost all your health. So it could have a lot of potency, especially with some of the conduits that I'm looking at right now here, which is just increased critical strike chance by 2%, and crit being one of the best stats for Feral in PvE. It seems like a good selling point. It's got crit built into a lot of the soul binds as well for the talent tree for the Venthyr. So in PvE, it seems like a really good build, especially if you want to focus around Incarnation and pair these cooldowns up. But do note that in PvP, you're going to have some drawbacks because other players can play around this and punish its negative side effect a lot more than a monster is. You're basically only going to be able to punish yourself if you use it poorly in PvE. Door of Shadows, just really good extra little bit of mobility. But in terms of the extra little passives, you just get some interrupt reduction and snare and root reduction, I believe. But as Feral, you don't care about snares or roots, so it's only interrupts, and you're only really casting Clone. In PvE, you don't care. You're probably not even going to be running that soulbind. But in PvP, it's just kind of like, So this one's a little bit weird, right? In terms of viability for PvP. In PvE, it seems like a really good sell, but we'll have to wait and see. Obviously, tuning could determine it being awful or really good. Adaptive Swarms is what I was talking about. This is probably my most favorite ability for Druid, because it just plays so strongly into being a hybrid. It buffs your dots and it buffs your hots. It's a short cooldown. You've got decision making on, do you want to start it as a heal or do you want to start it as a damage ability? It works for multiple specs if you want to be switching, to me, it just seems like a lot of fun. It's got good synergy with those legendaries I was talking about, where your dots start ticking a little bit faster. So Necrolord seems like a pretty good one to me. In PvE, maybe not, right? And mostly because when it bounces back to you and starts healing, in PvE, you don't care. In PvP, you might care a little bit. You cast a regrowth on yourself. But I guess in general, you don't really care about the healing part of it. You're really only caring, as Feral at least, you're only caring about the damage output. So if it ends up falling off, not being potent enough. Fleshcraft, it's just kind of meh in PvE, right? It's just an extra shield. Maybe you time it to beef up your health right before a big hit so that you can survive it. Could have use there. Its PvP effect with the ultimate form has been nerfed, so it's not just crowd control immunity all the time. It's only while you're channeling it, which means it can be kicked. And then if you do finish channeling it, you'll be immune to crowd control for 4 seconds. So, although think about this for a second, if you know you're about to pop Incarnation, right? So you go for your Fleshcraft and you finish the cast. Now you're immune to crowd control. You can go for Incarnation and you can't be stunned. Or you run away and you know somebody's chasing you to stun you. You pop that shield. You try and immune the crowd control. You bait the kick with a Cyclone and then you go for a Fleshcraft. I think there is still playability there, and going immune to crowd control as a Feral Druid is really good in PvP. And that's where the playability is going to be. In PvE, maybe you do start channeling it when you know a monster is casting a stun that's unavoidable, and you could immune the stun. Hey, I'm trying to get creative here, right? Because for a lot of people in PvE, it's like, does that do a lot of damage? No, I don't care. So I'm trying to be creative here and think of, like, does this actually have a PvE use? I can see it in PvP and possibly PvE. So Necrolord to me is like an overall good pick for the game if you want to be PvPing, PvEing, or you want to be playing other specs. It seems good as a good choice. Night Fae, this is the one that's a bit controversial at the moment, and it's got the most attention of any real Covenant spell I've seen, which is Convoke Spirits. Just cast 16 Druid spells. Now, they are going to be favoring specific things depending on the range and what form you're in. So, hopefully as Feral, and I believe that they've also added, so it'll cast Ferocious Bite, but it's at max combo points. So, it's a little bit weird. You can now move and cast it at least, but if you're kicked, 0 value. So if someone sees Convoke the Spirits, okay, it's gone. If you do finish the channel, maybe it doesn't get a massive benefit. You could pop it with Heart of the Wild as a combo and maybe heal up your team or heal up your group. This could be a good recovery mechanic for you if you want to be going into that hybrid role. And I'm speaking fun, right? Maybe performance-wise, it's not going to end up being the best, but fun factor, it could work out really well and be a lot of fun. So to me, it's a little bit of a cheeky build. You also get the cheat death effect from the soulbind conduits, but mostly I've noticed from Night Fae is that they give slows from their soulbinds. You don't really care about slows as feral. You're already pretty much applying one all the time anyway. So take that into consideration as well when you're going to be going for the Night Fae. It's just a little bit cheeky. It will really depend on the tuning of Convoke the Spirits as to whether or not it works, and it can be outplayed heavily in PvP, which is a big downside. Looking at the conduits, which are now available. So you'll be able to only have one of each of these in your little talent tree. So if it's got 2 potency slots, I would only be able to put potency feral 1 and then one of these other ones if I wanted to do that, right? You can't stack them is what I'm trying to say, at least not at the moment. This one is just Ferocious Bite, deals 3% increased damage for each of your bleeds on the target. Really big combo there. I mean, you can combine that with the other legendaries. If it's free and deals maximum damage, I feel like that's going to get a ton of value. So this seems like a pretty good sell to me, just in general for feral PvP or PvE, as a good potency conduit. Here, Rip damage has a 10% chance to grant 3 energy. Really good as just a conduit, because your energy regen is going to be a big problem. That's a nice one right there. Druid potency feral 3, finishing moves with a 3% chance for combo points spent to make your next rake or shred deal damage as though you were stealthed. So rake does extra 100% damage. If you're running that legendary that increases the tick rate of the bleed, and you got this proc, you could get a really fat rake tick going on a target. It seems like a very low odds though, only 3%, and the other one is also really low proc rate for the legendary. So maybe this doesn't end up working out, but this is one that you'll probably have to play around with, which is a bit unfortunate because you have to wait a week, I think, to change. You only change these every week, so if you wanted to try that for fun, you have to wait a week. There's some really I don't like that stuff about Shadowlands, but this wouldn't be worth the risk to me to try. These ones seem just very obvious and apparently good. Tiger's Fury damage, bonus damage is increased by 3%. I guess remember that these scale up. These are the tier 1 conduits, and they rank up. So this would be even more percent damage likely per bleed on the target. This would be a higher chance to get 3 energy, and then this would be a higher chance to get a better rake, and then the damage output would be increased. So maybe this one early on you're not getting a lot of value, but if this percent increase gets really out of control, then this conduit becomes solid late game. So I could see like early on you're focusing on these conduits, but then as you rank them up, this one ends up being really good, especially in PvP. Maybe not so much for PvE. And then you've got conduits that work directly with your covenant. So if you want to be empowerment cooldown is reduced by 10%, so you can buff up your partners a little bit more frequently. It's not that great because it's already such a short cooldown. Ravenous Frenzy increases your critical strike. We already talked about that being nuts for feral and PvE, with crit being a very important modifier. So this makes it even better. I feel like it's mandatory if you're running Ventier to have that. Adaptive Swarm increases periodic effects by an additional 6%. Nice synergy there with your dots, especially with some of the legendaries to make them tick faster. And then while channeling Convoke the Spirits, your damage and healing are increased. Really good synergy for that hybrid build play I was talking about, using Heart of the Wild Convoke the Spirits for heals as a feral, and then using it for damage. This might be mandatory, but these ones seem really good. So it's kind of tough there. Endurance conduits here. So let me just sort this out. I don't think we've got all of them available. This doesn't look like all of them, at least. Maybe it is. Endurance is just defense, right? So this one will be Barkskin is more available, and this would rank up. So you'd be getting, a higher and higher reduction cooldown on Barkskin. For 4 seconds after shifting into bear form, your health and armor is increased. Could have synergy with Heart of the Wild and Frenzied Regen, because Frenzied Regen is based on your health for your personal survivability. I would think that in PvE you'd probably just want Barkskin available more often, but with how often stuns are available in PvP, you may benefit more from increasing your maximum health for Frenzied Regeneration. So this is a little bit of a tough call if you're a PvE and a PvP player for which one. Frenzy Regeneration and Regrowth healing is increased by 12%. Well, this one probably just buffs Frenzy Regen more than this. I changed my mind. This is probably not very good. Unless you were intending to off tank and you're pretending that it's classic WoW and you're in a chill casual guild, which most of the absolute optimizing sweaty players now, this is going to be tough for you if you're in that group of people. But this one just flat out extra healing. The endurance conduits are really good for feral. But there's probably, you're only gonna be able to get one from the way that I've looked at it usually. So might want to think about what situations you're going to be in most frequently when you're picking this. Finesse conduits, we're looking at utility now. So Iron Fur grants the target 50% movement speed and well fed. That's really weird. Why do you, that seems really weird. You get a food buff? It's only 20 primary stat. You get a little bit of primary stat, but the movement speed. So you're in bear farm, you pop Iron Fur and you could chase down a target like an extra sprint. That could be really good. Just an extra sprint. Stampeding Roar's radius is increased. The duration is increased. That's nice. Just buff up your healer from really far away. Get them in PvP, or your whole raid group moving if anyone's out of range. And it lasts a little bit longer. Seems really solid for raid. Mythic Plus maybe as well. The cooldown of Mighty Bash, Mass Entanglement, Heart of the Wild are reduced by 10%. Remember, this ranks up. So, I mean, what is the cooldown of Heart of the Wild going to be when this thing starts ranking up? That seems pretty nuts if you're running a Heart of the Wild build in PvP. In PvE, again, because you're running Feral Affinity, unless there's a lot of fights where you can't, the boss isn't attacked from melee range, which I feel like they don't do that very often, or it's not for a long period of time. Just kind of meh. But in PvP, that seems really nuts. So I think that's it. We've gone through all the conduits that are currently available. We've gone through all the covenants. We've gone through all of the legendaries. We talked about some of this baseline spells that have come back to the spec, and what are kind of like the in summary. So I think if you enjoyed Feral last expansion and its playstyle, you'll still continue to enjoy it. If you weren't getting invited for groups, I mean, if you were an unseen predator because nobody plays it, nobody sees you, it might be a little bit tough. I feel like Feral Druid gets flamed a lot and people aren't even activating their Fandrel's seed pouch. In Shadowlands, maybe not, because they're limiting cleave from a lot of classes, and now Feral could maintain dots on a smaller number of monsters, and a lot of its cleave is not being limited, much like the Primal Wrath and the Thrash, still hitting all nearby targets. So maybe Feral will become king of the jungle again. All right, if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, comment down below. This one was a little bit long. I appreciate you sticking all the way through. Please subscribe to the channel if you would like to continue to support me. It's absolutely free. You just click the little subscribe button. Lets you know when the videos go live, as I'm going to be pumping these out basically every day up to Shadowlands release, and I intend to keep making videos after that point, but we're gonna have to start coming up with some content here. We might have to become a React channel. No, I'm kidding. This channel is going to be a good resource for anybody interested in getting into World of Warcraft, and my goal is to have it provide information that I think is relevant for PvE and PvP for as many specializations as I can. And of course, I appreciate getting called out when I'm wrong, because I want the information to be correct and accurate, and I do my best to make sure that it is. So, but if it's not, don't be afraid to call me out. I am definitely not afraid to be wrong. Anyways, thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.